Hi, this is Allan Kozinn, co-author of the McCartney Legacy, and you're watching Tom and Andy on the Fantastic Two Legs podcast.
Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Two Legs. This is episode number 271, and my name is Andy Nichols, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Two Legs, and joining me today is one of the co-founders of Two Legs, rocking a great Two Legs white hoodie, is Tom Hunyadi. Good afternoon, Tom.
Hello, Andy. Good to see you, my friend. Good to see our guests, and tell you, I just finished this wonderful book this morning, and I cannot wait to read it again. So much great information.
Yeah, at long last, we have Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair, co-authors of the McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 to 1980. Back on for a proper review of the book. Gentlemen, how are you?
Fine.
Good.
Yeah, very well. It doesn't feel like 2 days since we were last on your podcast, to be fair.
No, it's been about, five weeks since release date now. So how's the early returns looking so far? How's the buzz been?
The buzz is great. I mean, I think, the things that people are saying, I couldn't have written myself better. People are finding that they're learning new things. Some people are going as far as to say on every page. I don't know if that can possibly be, but I'm glad they're saying it. And people are really enjoying it, and a lot of people like it better than the first volume. So it's going great.
Yeah, Adrian,
Great. Yeah. A friend actually just sent me the review that's coming out soon in Record Collector, I think we got 4 out of 5 stars, and a glowing review again from Record Collector. So, yeah.
Well.
No one is complaining that we have too much detail this time, so people have finally gotten on to what we're up to.
About time. They finally woke up and realized what you were actually trying to do here with this series of books, which is we both actually just finished it today, so it was literally like about a few hours before we recorded this, just doing this show. We finished it because, as we know, there's only so many hours in a day, but we're just reading a little bit, and we just finished it, and boy, I can't wait to dive in and go into it. So right off the top, I mean, your book opens up in 1974, boom, hot on the heels of Band on the Run coming out in December, and Paul dives right into McGear and just throws his head into working with Mike McGear to release this at Strawberry Studios in Stockport and put this whole thing together. But it's kind of sad reading about it, that when you think about it, that was really just do you think it was really like a ploy of just to lure Paul to go to Warner Brothers and just use Mike as a pawn and just kind of dangle it out there? Because that's what it seems like a little bit, and you wrote about that in the book.
It may seem like that a bit. I mean, certainly from Warner's point of view, a very strong part of why they would have been interested in taking the album is the possibility of getting Paul as well. And they had been, this was a long game for them. They go back to Volume 1, they underwrote some of Denny Lane's sessions for what became the Lane album. And that probably was for a similar reason. But, I mean, if they really hated the album, I don't think they would have taken it. And,
right.
And Mike did have, not so much in the U.S., but he did at least in England have some kind of track record, with the Scaffold.
Scaffold, sure.
Right.
How does that record sit on your ears now? 50 years later, was it something that you can listen to and enjoy, or you went through it just to kind of do the research and learn about the sessions and all that as an album? Is it something you enjoy, or you're like,
Well, I think when they reissued it a couple of years back, it was really refreshing to hear that record again, and the extras that came with it were fascinating as well. You know, some stripped back versions of some of those songs. Yeah, from our perspective, obviously, we spend a lot of time, you know, micro analyzing every song. So
every song.
So yeah, you end up kind of coming away from, you know, every single album you look at. You know, with new favourites and a fresh appreciation of kind of what Mike and Paul were doing there on that album.
Yeah, and I know chronologically that's where the story begins, but I really wasn't expecting, you know, months ago when I got the book to open it up and be reading about McGear for a chapter or so just to start the next volume. I'm like, where's the Paul? Like, where's the Wings stuff? And well, that was the Wings stuff because it was basically a Wings album all in name.
Right.
It really, yeah. So. That was interesting to do that. Looking back on it now, one of the things I wanted to just, and this kind of applies to everything you've kind of written in the book, one of the things that you guys talk about with the recording sessions, and I'm fascinated where you got your information on this, is these reels. Everything that's been recorded, you've written about every session, and the reels were done. Where did that information come from? For I mean, it might be multiple people, but you have everything down to like a science of what was recorded, when, who took it, and what was done on it. Like, how did you guys find that out?
Well, McGear album wasn't an easy one because all the paperwork from those sessions was destroyed when Strawberry Studios shut down. I think from what Pete Tattersall told me, it was just basically all thrown in a skip. So as you can imagine, you know, there may have been some, you know, curious passers-by who helped themselves to, you know, little bits and pieces out of that skip, as they do. So yeah, basically we didn't have much to go on with that album. Only really what came out of the McGear Deluxe box set and a few other bits and pieces of paperwork. But that's really been the case all the way through this project, really. That some albums we've been given paperwork by collectors. Some albums we've been given paperwork and diaries by recording engineers. So really there's no one kind of like oracle source when it comes to the, you know, the recording paperwork. So yeah, when you're reading about reels, you know, they could be, you know, some documents we've been given by a collector where, for example, you know, we were given some documents that related to Paul's demo recordings from Rude Studios. So there's quite a lot of information in the book if you see about kind of various demos that were recorded at Rude Studios throughout the 70s. They came from a collector. But yeah, I mean, the whole those first two books took us 10 years to put together, and really what you're seeing there is a culmination of 10 years worth of research. It's not just something that we were able to throw together overnight with the help of the MPL vaults. You know, that would have been a lot easier.
Sure. The fact that you, I think the fact that you spent 10 years of work of research and writing two books to have these two volumes come out 2 years apart. It's amazing, that fact that all that you don't realize, maybe we don't realize because we didn't write it, but you guys spent 10 years of your life putting putting this work together. Now it's out there for everybody to read, reread, absorb. It's why you can go back to it and learn new things because they're so exhaustive and there's so all the details in them. It is really it's the gold standard, and you know, we are just so thankful that we have these books because you could, I mean, I reread parts of part one again, and I'm like, oh, forgot about that, because that's the kind of level of research and writing you guys did to the T of everything. So they're going to be so rewarding to read for generations of Paul fans to come, and we're just so happy that we have them, and it's just been a pleasure to watch this evolve and grow, and it's been awesome. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I like to start with I was really fascinated about the publishing aspect of, you know, Paul's, you know, during the books here, starting in 75, right? He gets the Love Me Do P.S. I Love You. He gets the rights back, and I'm curious on how. I mean, does he share that with John then, since he was a co-writer, or does he just give him like a higher percentage? I'm curious on how that would work. But then, you know, the Eastmans get him the H. Morris music rights, and then later on, while dealing with Columbia, which we'll talk about later, he gets the Frank Music Corporation. I mean, these are all just adding to his his wealth,
Empire.
and then these are just making money as he sleeps. I mean, these are things that the Eastmans are pushing him to get, and he also wants to get this empire, if you will, as well.
Well, he was into it too, and in fact, he'd been into it for quite a while. I mean, the Eastmans sort of told him, if you want to invest, you might as well invest in something that means something to you,
Right.
and you love music.
Right.
And the Eastmans happened to also own a lot of music companies and art and all of these things that Paul was also interested in. So he was looking for an investment strategy. The Eastmans sort of nudged him towards that. But if you remember in the expanded Get Back that Peter Jackson put together, there was a scene where Dick James comes in to visit them, and they're looking through some paperwork and looking at titles of songs, and it turns out that was a catalog that Dick James bought for Northern songs. And at one point he says, "So we own these now, right?" Yeah. So that's sort of like an early clue to the new direction, so to speak. What would happen with Paul, and then the first thing that came up that he could get his hands on was the Buddy Holly catalog, and Buddy Holly was one of his heroes. So he had a great introduction to this. He had spectacular guides in how to do it in Eastman's. And so the Eastmans would have known what all the big publishing companies were that Paul might want. And I think not with Frank Music, but one of the other big ones that gave him the rights to Annie and Grease and all that.
Oh, that's the H. Morris.
H. Morris, yeah. The Eastmans also represented Edwin Morris. I think his name was Edwin, and so that became, they had to get another lawyer to represent one of them, but he was very familiar with that catalog, and that was a fantastic catalog. So made it easier for Paul to get, and Morris as well. I mean, Eastman was his lawyer, and so he trusted that if Eastman was going to recommend selling it to his son-in-law, it wasn't just it just wasn't just nepotism. It was, this Paul is really into this, and he'll take care of the catalog, which he has.
Right. So then, so with the Morris, he's getting Grease, and then, like you say, he's getting Annie. So, he's getting, so when the movie comes out, when Grease comes out, is he getting a percentage of the music being in the film as well as the soundtrack?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the singles, those multi-million selling singles from that. And you asked about, Paul acquired the rights to Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You through one of those deals, and that was owned exclusively by Paul. The copyright, it was his.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then if you would have shared that with John a little bit more, or give him a higher percentage of what he would have gotten, anyways. Do you think he would have probably given John maybe a higher royalty rate off of those two songs then, since he was a co-writer?
We don't have any information about that. If he did, it never was made public.
No.
I mean, very few people really even knew how he got. We've known that he's owned those two songs for a while because, he put out P.S. Love Me Do, and it was MPL Music.
Right.
But it was sort of a big mystery how he got them until we're working through it, and it's he's gonna buy Ardmore from Capitol. That's interesting.
Ardmore
and
Beechwood.
That's right.
They own Ardmore and Beechwood own those two songs.
I actually bought on eBay, I think it was, every so often MPL released these catalogs of the songs that they own, and I think there was one released in 1977. In fact, I think it's in that cupboard behind me, if you want me to dig it out for you.
Go ahead.
And flicking through there, I saw those two songs, and I said, wow, that was part of that catalog that he acquired. In sort of 75. Right. And I don't think many people realized that he got the rights back to those two songs, and yet to this day,
that was just U.S. though.
Still fighting.
That would have been that would just been the U.S. rights though.
No, I think that was that was world rights. Yeah, because it's the copyright.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So, but obviously, still to this day, he's still fighting to get the copyright back on quite a lot of his.
Which, according to a viewer of our show, Susan Gagney, she's like the copyright guru. Paul's gotten a lot of copyrights back to a lot of Beatles music,
but not all.
Not all, but a lot.
Right.
A lot.
And he's still
like
he's
due to get back. He's due to get back Goodbye now. It's a delay, so sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to hear what Adrian was going to say.
Yeah, he still doesn't own. Maybe I'm Amazed is still owned by Sony. So yeah, it's incredible. But yeah, I'm sure eventually you'll get all of those back.
Probably. It's just interesting, just if we go back to Lee Eastman here, and the fact that he is Paul's father-in-law. He is a established attorney, connected guy into music publishing, and there's something about a 30-year-old Paul McCartney who, hot on the heels of being burned by Klein, and just really green with the whole industry at that time, having the safety net of a Lee Eastman as your father-in-law, counseling him and guiding him to think, this is what you should really do, almost like in a fatherly type figure, right? I mean, obviously Jim was still alive for a few more years, but Lee really could, from reading your book, you could really tell that Lee really put Paul's best interests, especially with the music publishing first and foremost throughout any kind of business dealing, even down to the stopping of the plays that were being done, and all that other stuff. He really, really treated him like his own son in a lot of ways, and that comes across in the book.
Oh yeah, I mean, Paul fell on his feet when he married Linda and ended up with a brother-in-law and father-in-law who were attorneys, music attorneys.
Music attorneys, yeah.
I mean, they helped him, kind of shape MPL and make it the huge kind of publishing empire that it is to this day. So yeah.
I mean, and then later on, Lee eventually passes away, and then John takes it over, right? Linda's brother oversees basically the whole operation until his death some years ago now, right?
John not long. Yeah, just a couple of years ago. Yeah.
It's a fascinating aspect. It's a parallel in the book that comes in and out, just like everything else in the book. Because you're presenting it as it happens. So, which is the great thing about the book, because you're reading about, okay, now Paul acquired this, and then it just all flows so naturally according to the events in which they, happened. So, well done. Now, moving ahead a little bit, one of the coolest chapters in the book, and you warned us this was going to be a good one, was the Nashville chapter. Woo-wee. Right. And boy, was it ever. Wow. Adrian actually had said that, wait till you read Nashville, it's going to blow your socks off. And boy, did it ever. The fact that, I could not believe this when I read this in the book, that for a minute, Paul really thought about scrapping Wings there for a minute. And this is it. This is not going to work out. I've got this disaster of a situation on my hands. And really we always knew Jimmy was a little bit of a wild man, but what happened in Nashville, getting arrested and crashing a car and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we only knew a kind of a fraction of what went on in Nashville until during the pandemic. I think it was sort of August 2020. Jeff Britton walked me through his diary for Nashville, and I was just sitting there, kind of, mesmerized, really, as he was reading each entry. It was kind of, this day we went to, the drive-in movie. And then the next day, we hooked up with our girlfriends, and Jimmy crashed a car into a ditch. And, he walked me through every single day of Nashville, and it was certainly eventful. And like you, I was surprised to hear from Jeff that he'd had private meetings with Paul and Linda discussing the possibility of giving Jimmy and Denny the elbow. It's incredible to even think that one of the founding members of Wings was nearly given the elbow in '74.
But as you wrote in the book, that Jimmy kind of brought out the bad boy aspect a little bit, and Denny Lane a little bit with the wildness and the drunkenness and the kind of the poor decision making. Whereas, it's just those two, they like to party, and Jeff is just a straight guy and just wants to show up and drum, and those two are off to, getting up to debauchery.
I mean, they were just living the life of rockers on the road, weren't they? Really, I mean, they all found girlfriends in Nashville, even if they had wives or girlfriends back at home.
Sure.
And they were just drinking, partying, taking drugs, hanging out with rock stars, hanging out with country music stars.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just, as they say these days, living their best lives, in Nashville for sure.
But it just, I mean, for 3 weeks they were there for, and they were not even a month, right?
It was 6 weeks.
Oh, it was 6
It was
weeks.
longer than you think. Yeah,
Well,
A lot of rehearsing.
A lot of rehearsing, and I think for guys like Jimmy, Jimmy and Denny, those guys just want to play. Idle hands is that's when bad things start to happen. They just want to go out and tour, and they want to gig all the time. So rehearsing, and that's a theme that comes out through the book a lot. Is the fact that there's so much downtime with recording albums that it really kind of it pulls members of Wings down at some point. Even Joe English later on in the book, he got a little bit tired of it all too. These guys really wanted to just gig, and it was tough. Paul just rehearsed these guys, to the bone, especially in preparation of the world tour. I mean, just over and over and over and over again. And these guys just wanted to just play every night and just get, pissed.
Well, I mean, you could hear on the recently released One Hand Clapping LP, that was basically the result of the rehearsing in Nashville.
Yeah.
So, they rehearsed those songs in Nashville to the point where they were almost perfected. So when they went into Abbey Road in August '74 to do One Hand Clapping, they had all of those songs down. So
yeah, ready to rock and roll. And then so Jeff leaves. I mean, Jeff is there at that point, and that's One Hand Clapping is September '74, right? Or August.
August,
yeah.
August, right? And so those sessions start, and the backyard stuff, and we got to see all that fantastically out on even though the quality's still not that great. And I think Jeff Britton, would it be fair to say, this was a question I was going to ask later, but in Volume 1, you guys had said how valuable Denny Sywell was to you, his diaries. And would it be fair to say that Jeff Britton is the Denny Sywell for Volume 2 for you, with the diaries he kept? I guess that portion of the book?
I guess he's one of them. Yeah, I mean, even people like the, recording engineer Peter Henderson, who did Speed of Sound.
Yeah,
he gave us all of his diary entries for the recording of that album, which were invaluable, because we got all of the overdub information and everything from Peter's diaries. But yeah, it's just a shame Jeff was given the boot so quickly, really, because it wasn't deserved one. I mean, we've all heard the One Hand Clapping record, right?
Sure.
They were cooking. They were really cooking on that album. And I think if Jeff was given a chance, he would have delivered on Venus and Mars. You just get the feeling that those kind of insecurities of Paul's started creeping underneath his skin, and he was getting little whispers in his ear from Jimmy and Denny, and that was kind of Jeff's fate sealed at that point.
Ugh. That's a pity, because but that's the great thing about One Hand Clapping now, that people now can actually hear this guy on a bona fide record, not on a bootleg, not on Junior's Farm, but here's a full live rehearsal in studio of this band cooking and playing well, which gives, and I'm sure that he must, I hope, and Adrian, I'm sure he's very elated. He must be happy.
Oh yeah, Jeff loves that album. Yeah. I speak to Jeff quite regularly still, probably every month or so. And yeah, cool. he loved that album. And they even did they arranged for a special screening of One Hand Clapping in his local cinema where he lives in Spain. So, and he did a little PA there and a Q&A and everything, and he was in his element. So yeah, it's great to see him finally getting some credit for the work that he did with Wings.
Only 7 months in the band, but properly recognized 50 years later, and he's still with us to appreciate it. And I think that's pretty awesome. And kudos to you for fostering that, relationship and getting what he got, and he kept all those things down. And thank God that he did, because now we know about it all.
Right.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to Jimmy for a minute, because I have seen some negative talk about, it seemed like you guys only put the negative in the book, which you didn't. You guys praised Jimmy a lot in the book as well. But however, you're telling and I'm not going to say that he was an alcoholic or a drug addict. Like you said, he's living the rock and roll lifestyle. But some of these things, positions that he got himself into, could have ruined and did ruin things that happened in McCartney's story. And you are telling McCartney's story, so you have to tell these stories because, like I said, they could have ruined certain things that had, he had consequences. I mean, that world tour, I mean, the US leg, I mean, that could have been worse. I mean, crashing the car in Nashville, that could have had serious consequences. I mean, they could have not gotten visas to tour America. I mean, so
Right.
you had to tell these stories because they did impact Paul's, you know, career to some point.
Yeah, plus they happened. And we're
Right.
telling what happened. You know,
Right.
it's not our fault that Jimmy acted the way he did. You know, can't blame
Right.
us just because we're reporting it. I mean, we praise his playing a good deal. You know, especially
Right.
in discussing the tour. You know, when he had a night when he was hot, we said so. So you know, and that was the upside of Jimmy. You know, so I don't see what people are complaining about.
Yeah,
Right.
I
I mean,
mean,
you have eyewitnesses, right? You have eyewitnesses. You got the bits and pieces from David Cassidy's autobiography, which I thought was pretty funny. So you've got people telling you these things have happened, So
not
yeah,
only
you have to
not
report
only
it.
do we have eyewitnesses, but you know, some of the people that we talked to who were there for these things, like Tony Dorsey, you know, who had to pull Paul
Hmm.
and Jimmy
Right.
apart and all that, and
yep.
you know, almost
Right.
all of them you know, said they kind of liked Jimmy, and we quoted them saying that, and we quoted them
Right.
saying that, you know, he was sensitive and you know, they all had something nice to say about him, you know, that, you know, may or may not be enough to excuse the stuff he was doing, but they felt well disposed towards him despite all the trouble, and we quoted them saying that. So, you know, that's fair.
Yeah, but
And
Right.
but
And then,
on the flip side, you know, when you know, a member of the band tells you that whenever Jimmy entered the hotel bar after a gig, they all kind of decided it was time to go to bed. I mean, you know, that's just the way that they felt. That's the truth, you know, because they knew what was coming.
I think, yeah, I think
So
Tony Dorsey said that in the book. He
yeah,
said that he like they were
right.
there, they were in the lounge, and he just disappeared to his hotel room to avoid it
yeah,
because he
yeah.
knew what was going to
Right.
happen.
You can't dress that
Right.
stuff up. I mean, that's the truth. That's what we were told by a lot of
Right.
people. You know, the thing is, you know, we put a lot of consideration into what we quote and what we don't quote. You know, it's not like we just put all the most horrible, salacious stuff in our books. I mean, you've read them; they're very balanced. And we feel that, you know, we represent both sides of Jimmy's character, the talented guy and the troubled guy,
Mm.
and really that kind of sums Jimmy up to a T. That's exactly what he was.
Yeah,
He was a very talented
Right.
guy who had some demons, you know.
Demons.
Yeah.
He did.
Right.
He absolutely
And then
did.
he Yeah, and Paul went on his out of his way to cover for him. He covered him for
Yeah.
him for the accident, right? Covered for him for leaving the band. So he went on his way to make sure that some negative things didn't get out into the press.
Yeah. I mean, Jimmy was arrested for reckless driving in Nashville. You know, if he'd have been convicted, that would have meant that Wings
Yeah.
wouldn't have been able to tour America, and he wouldn't have been able to
Right.
record Venus and Mars in America.
No.
In the end, you know, we found the paperwork, we've seen all the documents. You know, they had to employ a specialist immigration lawyer off the back of Jimmy's arrest in Nashville just to secure them visas to work in America.
Wow.
You know, so that's the sort of level of trouble it was causing Paul. You know, these weren't just personal issues. This was causing them legal trouble as well. So, you know, and like I said, that we're basically, as Allan said, we're just telling the story like it was.
But
you know, we're
despite
not
all
dressing
that,
it up.
but despite all that, Paul keeps him around. I mean, anybody else, he would have said, "See you, buddy. You're out of here."
He's a
Right.
talented guy. Yeah.
you know, something like that. I mean, this is a man with a family, a
Yeah.
young family. He doesn't want to. He's got young kids, and he's going to have this wild guy getting drunk and breaking TVs and just wrecking up cars all the time. I mean, it was a pretty bold move to keep him around.
But I mean, you know, if you remember in Volume 1, though, I mean, Henry McCulloch was drinking bottles of brandy and thrown up on the side of the stage at Top of the Pops. So this isn't new.
No.
You know, Paul's lived through this many, many, many times. So this isn't new behaviour to him. He saw it with John and George when they were together in Hamburg.
And
when they were on tour around Great Britain and Europe in the Beatles. You know, this isn't new behaviour. So Paul knew what to expect from a 20-something guitarist, and he did cover for him frequently. So, like we said, we're just presenting the facts. That's all we do in our books, and the readers can make up their own opinions.
Yeah, and
what they think of people.
I think you presented a fair and balanced view of Jimmy's life and during his tenure in Wings, the good and the bad, until his exit, and sadly his death. So there was no other way to paint it other than what happened, which is what you guys always said. This is what happened. Take it or leave it.
Also,
you got Paul.
Jimmy died, quite a long time ago. We never met him. We have nothing against him. We have no issues with him personally, ourselves. We're just giving the facts again. There's no, we have no axe to grind about Jimmy, really.
Our books have no agenda. You won't find an agenda in our books. We're not demonizing Paul. We're not setting Paul up to be a saint. We show a balanced account of everybody, and unlike a lot of other people who write books like these, who may have an agenda, but we don't. So,
no. One of the key things that I've just read, and every part of the book has a key contributor from somebody that gave sound bites, Peter Henderson's Peter Sound. One of the ones that strikes out to me in Volume 2 was what Tony Dorsey had to share during the New Orleans stuff with Venus and Mars. He gave you a lot of great quotes in that book, and in that chapter regarding his time and breaking up Paul and Denny. But just, he sounded like he was a great interview, and got a lot of. How long ago did you interview him for Volume 2?
I think that was like 2019.
Wow.
And he was a great interview, and he was very self-effacing, as you see throughout the book. I mean, the arrangements that he did for Venus and Mars, listen carefully to those. I mean, there's even things like, you gave me the answer. He's got a lot of stuff going on with the different woodwinds and sort of dialogues between them, things like that. And when you talk to him, he just says, Paul would just sort of tell me what he wants. And he'd say, I want to go from, this key to that key. What do I do? And I would just sort of say, well, you can do this. He didn't seem to want to take a lot of credit. And yet you listen to those arrangements and they really are transformative. They make them into exactly the kind of piece that Paul envisioned, which is, why he brought him back, because he did some arrangements in Nashville, and then he brought him down to New Orleans to do those, and then brought him over for the world tour, and again in 1979. He was a good guy, and he just seemed, he had a way of talking where you get the feeling that to him, everything he's saying is just logical and obvious. And, one example of that is when he's pulling Paul and Jimmy apart during that fight. And Jimmy says, did you see what he did to me? And I said, well, just don't make him angry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just don't make him angry. That was great. Did you see what he did to me? Things like nuggets like that are just what is fascinating to read in this book. Somebody that, here's just a name on a sleeve we've read for decades, but you actually hear the person's take and what really went on. And he actually was credited, when after the Tony Visconti fiasco of special thanks, Tony got the credit.
you do get the feeling with Tony that his personality was the reason why he ended up working with Paul, for so long and so well, actually, because being so laid back, that just perfectly complements what Paul's looking for in an arranger, really. Somebody who's not wanting to take the credit, but at the same time delivering exactly what he wants, every time. And if you listen to the songs that Tony did the arrangements for, like Allan said, they're transformative. They're incredible.
Yeah, for sure. Moving ahead in '75, the one of the big kind of like blurbs that made the headlines when Volume 2 came out was the Isaac Asimov storyline and Paul's fascination with film and sci-fi, and that weaves its way throughout the book too, all the way up to Back to the Egg. Tell us about how you discovered the Asimov, story.
Oh, it was one of those stories that we'd heard sort of mentioned in forums and things in the past, this idea that Asimov and McCartney had collaborated together. So I dug out Asimov's 2 memoirs that he wrote, and he mentioned this project that he'd done with Paul. So then I did a little bit more digging to find out, when Asimov passed away, whether or not he left his paperwork with any particular archive or university. And I tracked it down to Boston. And this was actually, during the pandemic. And I thought I'd have to fly out to Boston and visit there in person, because that's generally the practice, and scan the documents myself. But in the end, because it was the pandemic and I couldn't get over there, the librarian said to me, well, I've got nothing else to do right now because the library was shut. So she went down to the archive and she scanned these documents for us and sent me a PDF. So in the end, we had Paul's original treatment, which you can read the whole thing in the book, because we present that there, together with Asimov's responses to it, which came from other documents we got from Asimov's archives. I think a lot of people, don't realise just how much stuff is out there. You mentioned earlier the sort of correspondence from Warner Brothers about the McGear album. Again, they came from an archive in America, and I suppose we had the luxury on this project of having the time to look for these things, because we worked on this project over a period of 10 years, and I could focus quite a lot of my time on research while Allan was writing. But yeah, it was pretty mind-blowing when we read Paul's original treatment, and I think I was quoted in the British press as saying that it reads like something that Paul and Linda cooked up after smoking something particularly heavy. Which is kind of, I think that's a pretty good, succinct description of Paul's original treatment for 5 and 5 and 1.
Right. It's a theme that is pretty consistent throughout the '70s there. He's fascinated by sci-fi, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's always, every couple of years, he's coming back to this film concept, and incorporating with Band on the Run and all this other stuff, and it never comes to fruition, and it's one of those things that he just always wanted to do, and he never got a chance to do it.
I guess that you could say the same for Rupert, really, because I recall when we were speaking to Barry Chattington, who did Bruce McMouse, one of Paul's long-shelved projects. He said that they were working on storyboards for Rupert, even when he was doing Bruce McMouse. So we're talking 73, 74. And you'll read in the book that, they had some animation done for Rupert in the late 70s that's never seen the light of day, because the animation was so complex that Paul realized that it was going to take too long and be too expensive to follow through. So again, the same thing happened really with Rupert. It was kind of, I think Paul realized that it was going to require a lot of labor and be, financially, prohibitive to do it. That's basically why the Sci-fi project was shelved, because he went to the cinema and saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind and probably just thought, how do you top that? I suppose it's like forming a band when you've been in the Beatles,
Right.
How do I top that?
I can't, the sci-fi thing is done. There's Star Wars, there's Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Right.
I can't top that at all. I'll release a quasi sci-fi album called Venus and Mars, and that's about the best I could do. But then he goes into, go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really thought there was a chance with, then working with Gene Roddenberry later on in the decade. I really thought that there could have been, working with Gene, I thought there was a really good chance that we could have seen something, come to fruition. Here's somebody that, obviously the Stark Star Trek creator. It's just a shame that those two couldn't make something happen together.
Well, partly I think it was that Paul was trying to sell the same story to Roddenberry, and it's possible that Roddenberry also saw some defects in it that he wanted to fix. But apart from that, that was around that period when Paul saw Star Wars and saw Close Encounters and began to realize, if you, I know that when I first saw Star Wars, when it came out in 77, I was struck as a Star Trek fan by the difference in technology involved in that film versus what we were used to with Star Trek. You remember with Star Trek, when the ship would get hit by a photon torpedo or something, they would all go like this,
right?
And I think but when Paul saw that, I think he also was realizing, okay, there's going to be a cost involved in making it look like this, and that's probably further than we want to go just to have a Wings sci-fi film. So, but he didn't give up the idea of film, he then worked with Willie Russell, as we get into in the book too, and then in the next volume, of course, we'll have Broad Street.
Of course. And while we're on the films thing, it was fascinating to read and learn. All the Rupert music that was done there was done in a single session.
Right.
I couldn't. I've had that on bootleg forever, but I did not realize all that music was all done in one single session, according to, I think, Juber. Juber told you guys that.
Yeah, yeah.
The Rupert project is fascinating because it goes all the way back to the end of the Beatles. Paul wanted to do something with Rupert. Yeah. He's never really let that too far go to do it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see a feature length Rupert in the future.
Yeah,
given that animation these days is
right.
it's just less costly and it's more accessible, and I think that. I wouldn't be surprised to see him explore Rupert again.
I mean, we got a 100th anniversary release of it, but again, on the little flexi disc thing. But it's been a, McCartney and animation and film has been a total subgenre of study that you could even just outside of his main canon of albums, you could have, you could have a whole series of books on that too. Incredible. Couple other aspects here that we just pointing through that pop out. One of the things I thought was really funny was his back and forth kind of friendly fire with the people of Hypnosis when it came to album artwork. God, that was never really, we want to do this. Nah, but it's really got to be this way. And that was just the end of the conversation. And that happened with just about all the album cover designs, all the way up through Back to the Egg. And that, it's just fascinating. My way or the highway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they were used to working with bands like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, who kind of gave them a bit more, let them off the creative leash a bit more, shall we say? But Paul and Linda always had very definitive ideas about kind of what they wanted their cover to be, and it's interesting actually to just a tiny story point during that Venus and Mars session is to see the evolution of that cover idea. And where it came from, it just came from them playing a game of pool in the back of the studio, and they saw, there's a red ball and a yellow ball, and they loved the idea of that against the kind of black canvas, and that was it. Really, it's a really simple concept, really simple idea, it certainly did, rub up Storm, wasn't it, from Hypnosis? Poe and Paul got along very well. In fact, Poe worked with Paul into the 90s, I think. They were working on projects together, even live projects and things like that. So, but Storm and Paul didn't get on.
Did you guys see the Squaring the Circle documentary, the Hypnosis documentary?
Yeah,
it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Paul's on there a lot talking about, and I especially love the story that he wants to tell about, the All the Best cover shoot, because he wants the statue up on Mount Everest.
Wings greatest.
Wings greatest.
Yeah, Wings greatest. What did I say?
Yeah.
What did I say?
All the best.
All the best.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm at Wings Greatest. But he wants it on Mount Everest, but obviously it doesn't go on Mount Everest. But I still think he wants to say Mount Everest because
Yeah,
it's the better story.
That was a really funny story because
Oh,
Poe told us all about everything that was involved in the helicopter and the whole deal.
oh, got all that
And
whole
then he-
detail. Yeah.
And then you look at the cover and that could have been shot in your living room, really. It didn't, because he had shots with the other mountains in the background, and Paul didn't want those. And at the end of it, he said something to Paul like, we didn't have to go to this length to do this. And Paul said, "Yeah, I know, but we did."
But and I think you even said that, Allan, in the book. I think you did call it. It's a bit excessive. You did say that. I mean, it's true. Go ahead.
It's interesting, that when we were looking at that album cover there, we instantly drew a comparison to the Supertramp album.
Even in the quietest moments.
Even in the quietest moments, because it's a piano on top of a mountain. It's almost identical.
It really is.
You just get the feeling that Paul was sent a complimentary copy of that by EMI or whoever Supertramp were signed to, and it kind of sparked a little idea.
Oh, I think I want to do this. One of the greatest things I learned, we've always seen that statue that actually is still, I think, on display in MPL in the window.
Yeah.
You can see it. I love that in the book. We actually have a name for the statue. It's called the Semiramis. I forget I don't know how you
Something
say it.
in
Allan.
Latin, yeah.
Yeah. But that's Paul's Semiramis sculpture. I love how you gave a name to it though. I'm like, there's a statue.
Well, we found the listing, I think, from when it was originally sold at Christie's. I think it was, yeah.
This is what we're talking about, folks. This is the detail here. We found the research of the sale of the statue that's on Wings Greatest. That's who we're talking to.
Right. That's the kind of minutia we love.
Yeah. Another big tale was the near drowning experience in Hawaii. Wow. Big time, just because Paul wasn't going to listen to what, wasn't listening to what the lifeguard said.
Not Manson.
And he went out there and nearly dies. And I think you guys told us this when we launched the book live on our channel, that you just found that through an article, right, Adrian, in a Hawaii newspaper?
Well, Paul mentioned that in an interview that we found, and it was kind of one of those details that just seemed to have slipped through the cracks of history.
Yes.
For decades. And we found out that they'd been in Hawaii, and that was where Paul wrote a few songs as well, including Girls' School. So we did a little bit of digging to see if they popped up in the press, and invariably when Paul and Linda were in town, they were in the newspapers. And there was even a piece about Paul walking around with bandages the day afterwards, and I think they went to a concert there, didn't they? We found out quite a few details through the local press.
I mean, like really scary, like almost died. Like
it's one of those themes that's run through both books, really. I mean, it's not so pervasive that it's on every page, but there are these incidents all through both of them that really boil down to, I've been given advice and I don't have to listen to it.
You both make that point abundantly clear in both volumes. That's him at his core. He's not going to be told what to do, whether it's going for a swim or whether he's going to go. The bass has to sound a certain way. He just hates being told what to do from the time he was probably a young boy to the present day. It's just that's who he is.
Yeah, I put it down to sort of just classic stubborn, working class.
Stubbornness.
Stubbornness. That's all it is, really. That's what it comes from. He probably spent quite a lot of his life when he was younger being told what to do, and it's that kind of rebellious streak, isn't it, that we all have when we're teenagers, but he just hasn't let go of it. But yeah, if you go to any working man's club in England, you'll find, dozens of people like that with that kind of working class defiance.
Despite that, though, he's still a very grounded guy. His kids are all grounded, and despite that defiance, his family is he's still very tied to his family and his kids, and so it's kind of like he can be that way, but there's a little bit of a side of him that says, you know what, I don't really care what you say, I'm going to do it anyway. One of the things that we've always heard about a lot, but I'm very curious what research you've pulled and maybe May Pang helped you with this. I don't know, but we all heard that John was going to maybe reunite with Paul in New Orleans for Venus and Mars, but Yoko kind of put a stop to it. Did you find anything else that kind of supports that, or that anything new in the research department to
Well, we found a letter that John wrote to Derek Taylor that I think we quoted in the book, where he mentions that he's going to, or probably going to, visit the McCartneys, which he spells McCart, Knees,
right,
in New Orleans, and he was kind of keen on seeing the Mardi Gras as well. I don't know that I would blame Yoko. I don't think I would phrase it as Yoko put a stop to it. I think it was really, maybe she did, but I think it was really, he chose that time to get back together with her, and he also chose to work on his marriage instead of going off to see the Mardi Gras and work with Paul. That was just a decision that he made. I don't know that blaming Yoko for it is really, absolutely the, accurate.
And not because obviously there's decisions made there. It's easy to say that.
It's partly Paul's fault too, because one, he agrees to help Yoko by persuading John to get back with Yoko.
Yeah.
Right.
So
it's interesting.
He's partially to blame as well.
I've been reading the book recently about the Morris Levy case.
Oh yeah.
And one thing I didn't realize was just how heavily intertwined the timeline was with John possibly going to New Orleans. So you get the feeling that may have also influenced John's thoughts around that time, because he was having to deal with a lot of stuff relating to the Morris Levy case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then that visit doesn't happen, and then Paul goes and writes "Call Me Back Again," which I thought was pretty interesting. Writing that song on the heels of John not turning up to New Orleans. Just if you want to do a little bit more of a psychological deep dive on the behind the meaning of a song, but it's just interesting. You guys reported that that's the next song that he wrote after the non-Lennon appearance in New Orleans.
Well, the genesis of it actually was earlier in '74 when Paul visited John in L.A.
Oh, L.A., right.
He hadn't finished it, when they brought it out to do at Venus and Mars. He hadn't quite finished it, and he decided to sort of vamp his way through it, and it was one of those vamps that worked.
Yeah.
But he had the basic idea, "Call Me Back Again," and we kind of felt that coming out of a couple of meetings with John, there was the jam, and then the next day he went to where John and May were living in Malibu and spent the day with them, and he saw them again as well. That "Call Me Back Again" was, they had probably, having seen each other for the first time in a long time and gotten along very well, that they probably, like anybody would, made a commitment to keep in touch,
Mm-hmm.
and it seemed likely, we can't say absolutely positively, but it seemed likely that "Call Me Back Again" sort of came out of that, and then working on it after John didn't turn up, all that almost adds extra weight to that interpretation.
Yes.
If this was the genesis of the song, and now here's the song being,
and here's the end of it. Yeah, for sure.
Paul, we know Paul as being the PR guy, but the one thing that he's not relatively good when it comes to PR is people's deaths. Dealing with his father's death, I'm curious if you guys buy into his stories of, one, well, if I go, the press will be involved, and two, well, this was the time where we're guys and we can't show our emotions, and we don't want to cry in front of other people. Do you buy into that the theory of Paul being that way? And plus he's not far. It's in between shows, I believe, during the tour, and do you buy into that for being a reason for him not to show up at his father's funeral?
Well, I mean, I think the way we explain it in the book is probably pretty accurate, to be honest with you, which is that, Paul was obviously very deeply scarred by losing his mother at such a young age.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, his relationship with death was kind of formed around that time, during those formative teenage years. And from that time on, he's found it difficult to look death in the face. You just have to look at his kind of recorded material, that he's only really started exploring death during his last few albums, hasn't he?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Which was interesting to hear, actually, when he does write a song about death and his own death.
At the end of
the end. Yeah.
End of the end. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, no, it was it was a strange period to document that, really, with what was going on
In the
And
middle
I
of
think-
Right.
in the middle of a tour.
of the tour, and Paul kind of, I think, as we describe it, he kind of goes into full me and him mode, which is, me is
Right.
mourning the death of his father, and him.
Him.
the
Right.
performer, is walking
Right.
through the airport, giving peace signs to, and interviews to journalists. And how he could do that only a few, days or hours after his father's death is just
Right.
mind blown, really. I don't think I could have done
Right. On top
No.
of that, then he's also not necessarily getting along with his Jim's wife, Angie, and it looks like there's a few times where he wanted her out of the picture. Why is she involved when all she's trying to do is just honor his wishes by taking care of him, keeping him at home. He doesn't want to go to a nursery or anything like that.
Yeah.
Nursing care. So she's trying to do her best into keeping good care of him.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of that was probably to do with the fact that Paul was playing the middleman. Angie was, at loggerheads with some of Paul's family, some of the aunts and uncles, and Paul was there, as the in-between guy, which must have been quite difficult for him, really, because there's his blood relatives saying that your father should be treated this way, and yet his own dad is telling Angie that these are my wishes, which is what and Angie was just following what Jim wanted. So it was a difficult time for Paul, I think, really, being in between those two things, and really that's what caused a lot of the conflict with Angie.
And I think I read somewhere that there's a quote attributed to Mike McCartney saying that he's not surprised that our kid did not show up to this. He was never going to show up to it. It was never. It's not who he is. I'm not surprised he wasn't here. He was not going to be here, and that was widely reported at the time that when Jim did pass away. During one aspect, though, and since we are on the tour, Allan and Adrian, I don't know who did more of the work on this, but like one of the things in this part of the book, the tour, the American tour, it takes up a good chunk of the book, right? And every city, the reviews that you spotlighted, differences that happened each night of the concert, whether he ad-libbed something differently or the story before yesterday. I mean, really, really, going through that, was that pretty tedious? And then listening to these recordings, I mean, I'm sure you
Ask
both.
Allan.
Okay, that's an Allan question. That part of the book just seemed like it could have been, for a researcher, like very tedious, listening to the same recordings every single night and figuring out, well, did Paul change the story of yesterday, or did he do something else different the next night? How was that?
Well, as you guys on Two Legs know, we've been listening to those recordings for decades, voluntarily without doing a book. So, in most cases, these weren't recordings I was hearing for the first time. And the only tedious part was that, the technology of the time was such that, almost all of these are audience recordings.
Yeah.
And so some are more listenable than others, that's what I say about that. And you know how that is. But, I didn't find it tedious at all, because I was fascinated by the differences, what little changes he would make. And, and then you run into something like, the Zagreb concert where, the audience sings Yesterday.
Yes.
And he's so knocked out by it that he does it again, which is, I can't think of it. Maybe it's happened, but I can't think of another instance where he repeated a song, with the possible exception of, I think he might have done that with Freedom at that concert after 9/11.
That's for New York.
Yeah. I think he played it twice, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He did.
So other than that, I can't think of another instance. But with yesterday, you listen to the tape, you hear the audience stamping along and singing, and then we have the interview that Adrian did with, I guess it was either Morris Litta or one of the other technicians, sort of describing this, and describing Paul looking off to the side of the stage at him, like, wow. So yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun to listen to all of those things, and just so that if there was anything worth reporting on,
sure,
we would know it. We didn't really describe every single concert in minute detail, and the same with the reviews. We read all the reviews, and we're very selective about what we were quoting, because it had to be something that really captured something about the concert, but also captured the attitude of people watching the concert, at the time. Because we're also writing this as historians. We want to know what people thought then, and the reviews are a good indication of that. But, some of them are just so workaday. Some of them are, let me see how many Beatle title puns I can get into.
Sure.
All of that. So,
you got a good amount.
It's interesting you mentioned the reviews, because as we know, Paul largely, the critics enjoyed the 76 World Tour in America, but you do publish a couple of reviews that were not so good. And I have one here actually that I just wrote down. This was, I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was from the Times, but this was from the World Tour. When heard one after the other, Mr. McCartney's songs do not indicate the presence of genius. A handful are enduring of pop standards, and they deserve to be. Quite a few more memorable. The rest are well-crafted but forgettable, like Loggins and Messina's songs. Right. One enjoys them while they're going on and forgets them as soon as they're over. His rock fails to generate the sort of communal ecstasy the Rolling Stones and a handful of other bands create, and his ballads, which would be affecting in a more intimate environment, sound frail and disembodied in a hall as cavernous as Madison Square Garden. Really? Come on. But you published that one, so...
It's pretty funny. He'd been to a Loggins and Messina concert when he was in Hawaii, hadn't he?
Right.
Yes.
Maybe that's what he was trying to emulate.
Maybe. But still in 76, the anti-McCartney bias is still alive and well, even though they've largely won him over. But there are still a couple of people, and some of the reviews of even when we get to Mull of Kintyre, there's this. Especially in the UK, and let's not forget about his battle with NME and Charles Shaar Murray. God, they just did not like each other at all. And really, it was just that was fascinating to read when NME would be invited to something or they would not be invited to something, all based on, I think, his review of Venus and Mars. Isn't that right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember watching, I think it was an interview Paul did with something called Master Tapes on the BBC. I think it was something like 2005.
I think it was later than that. I think it was like 15.
And Paul, it might have been later. Yeah, you're right. And Paul was asked about critics. And I remember he stood up and he basically said something like Charles Shaar Murray.
I remember this. I remember this. Yes.
And I'm thinking, and when we were writing this chapter and the Charles Shaar Murray thing popped up, I thought, that's the reason why he despises this guy so much. This is a vendetta he's held against this guy for 40 years. Incredible.
And we wrote to Charles Shaar Murray to, get his perspective on it, and he didn't respond.
Shocking.
Why would
Shocking. Please lay it to rest, and I think you do in the book. But if you haven't read it yet, those of you who are watching, you'll find out. We've always heard about Wings Over America. No overdubbing was done. It was live as is. You kind of told the story that yes, a lot of post work was done on Wings Over America, and a lot of it was done. And you guys went into some detail about that, because that's always been very. Oh no, there are no overdubs. No, but there was.
It was quite a lot, yes. Yeah. Denny said in interviews that he basically redid his entire performance, not because it was bad necessarily. Or at least he says he just wanted to sort of toughen it up by doubling, the rhythm guitar. I think someone also said, and I think we included it, that Jimmy's parts needed probably less work than most.
Yes.
Yeah. So, again, were we unfair to Jimmy? We reported that.
And then the fact that the Rockestra or the rock show needed a lot of work as well. When Chris Thomas took that over, that was really interesting to see as well.
I mean, they sort of made that rod for their own back, didn't they, with that project, though? Because I think, as Chris explained it, anybody knows who's a filmmaker that the way you edit a music video is music first.
Always.
So you lay the music down and then you edit the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did with Rock Show and Wings Over the World was the exact opposite. So they would edit the pictures and then try and get the sound to work, which is just impossible.
You can't do that.
You end up with a Frankenstein monster of a timeline when you've got there could be even a tiny minor change in the guitar tuning or something that would be noticeable on every single edit. And also, things like the acoustics change from venue to venue, even when you're close micing and you're recording things through a desk. So poor old Chris Thomas came on board and basically, laid this all out to them, said, you've basically done this all wrong. And yeah, they ended up having to do a lot of work on that project as well to try and smooth everything out.
Yeah. And that project in particular, it's always just seemed like the tour was already 3 years in the can, and we're going to release this documentary about this tour. The time, it just seems like the timing would have been off for a documentary like that. Like, why not work on that and have it prepared for 1977? Like a year later, review a retrospective, looking back on it. But 3 years later, Wings has changed, incredibly again. That core band is gone, and now there's two new members, and you're pushing it out, a documentary that just seems like out of time. And I think you mentioned that in the book a little bit. What
I found very interesting was that when eventually Wings Over the World premiered, it came out on CBS television, and this was just after Paul had signed with CBS.
Columbia.
So you have to wonder whether or not they had some issue with distribution with that film. Whether or not, because nobody would touch One Hand Clapping.
No.
They just wouldn't take it, even though it was Paul McCartney, which these days, obviously it's just aired on Sky Television over Christmas here. Anything with Paul McCartney on, you'd think, they'll definitely want that. But you do wonder whether or not there was maybe a distribution problem and CBS came in and helped out on that front. The amount of post-production work they had to do, obviously.
But we had read over the years, a lot of back and forth. Oh, there was no post-production on any of that stuff. Well, clearly there was. Clearly there was, and you guys reported this.
Yeah.
Well, we also read that Mumbo was live in the studio, and it was just
right.
So we read lots of stuff, but that's why we're here. We're here to sort through what's true and what's not true. And we don't necessarily assume that what they've said isn't true. It's just that we keep looking until we find something else. If everybody in their interviews over the years had said, oh yeah, it was absolutely live, no touching up, that would be one thing. But Denny talked about it. Other people talked about it. So I don't know how the idea that it wasn't messed with got out there. Because I think people assume with any live recording there is some post-production work that's gone on. It just seems to be the case with every live recording I know of, anyway.
Right. Kiss Alive was as well.
I guess that's the biggest frustration from our perspective, is that if you go on the internet now and you search and look into the album Wildlife, for example, you'll probably still read that all of those songs were recorded in the first take. When we all saw in the deluxe box set, they published the tape box, which had
Yeah.
the tape numbers on it, so
And
you
you
could
knew
see some of them would take 6 or 7 or whatever. So that was a fallacy. And the same applies to things like, I was reading recently, and people are still saying that, Paul was influenced to write songs by certain things that John Lennon said, like Silly Love Songs, for example. And that Silly Love Songs was a reaction to something John said. And this has always been the story, when, again, we clarify in the book that that's just not true.
No, it's not.
That actually that song was an answer to more to people like Charles Shaw Murray, to say, I don't care what the critics say, I'm going to keep writing silly love songs, and there's nothing you can do about it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you about silly love songs. In the book, the first question he's asked about it, and the first time he's asked about it, he says, no, it's not about because the journalist says, is this about the response to critics? And he said no. But then he did make the comment, well, I mean, if you want to read into it, the line, what's wrong with that, is pretty much the your response to that, because what is wrong with that? So that was pretty fascinating to read about that too. Him not admitting it first, but then as we know now, he likes to say that this was kind of more of a response to what was being written about him being a balladeer for most of his career.
Well, I mean, even if he is saying, no, I'm not responding to the critics, the first line is, some people think the world's filled with silly love songs. Well, okay, who are those people?
Right.
If they're not critics and they're not John, and they're, it's got to be somebody. So he's not writing the song because Aunt Millie said it,
And it's funny because everybody attributes that song to John Lennon. Paul wrote that as a response to something John said. But from about 1975, for a period of I don't know how many years, John said next to nothing to the press. I think they gave one press conference when they were in Japan.
Japan, 78, as you reported in the book. Yeah,
they hardly said anything to the press. So I don't understand where that comment came from. It's just one of those myths that's just kind of developed over the decades.
You've squashed that.
Isn't there a scene in The Two of Us where they're meeting and then John's kind of putting him down for the song Silly Love Songs or something like that?
Yes.
The Michael Lindsay Hogg film.
The Michael Lindsay Hogg's film, which is
Well, maybe it was code. What he really meant is some people think the world is full of pizza and fairy tales.
Just before we wrap up the world tour, one of the coolest things about the book, and I think especially as sometimes as Americans, we kind of get lost in the fact that the tour did continue after America, albeit for only six shows. But what you guys reported about those shows in Austria and Zagreb and Venice were really, really fascinating to read about. Why those shows came to be, especially the one in Venice, which ended up being a charity concert because is that still from the flood, the Venetian flood of 1966, right? Which I think that's what Allan, you guys had written in there. Things like that, and I've got a couple of boots from those things, but those are kind of shows that most fans they fall off the radar a little bit, and then they actually close it with three at the Empire Pool in Wembley, and then that's really the end of the '76 tour. A lot, I think, sometimes, especially us Yanks, we forget about that. Those last couple of European shows, and the stories you guys shared about the hotels and all the traveling they did. And Paul wouldn't shut up about playing Zagreb. From what you guys read in the book,
right.
he was just like on cloud nine about playing there.
Yeah, as I've said before, the one thing we tried to do with the tours was to try and find one detail or one story about every single tour date. And I think Zagreb was one of my favourites because, as well as the Yesterday story, I think we tell the story about the projectionist. And the projectionist decides to try out the big projection screen by playing some pornography. And that's outlawed in Zagreb, and the guy gets arrested.
Yeah.
So a few hours before the concert, they've got to spring the projectionist from jail. It's just absolutely brilliant story.
Right.
Yeah. But we tried with those tours to try and keep them moving, whilst I've said this before, trying to make them feel like fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Like you're on the tour bus with the band and you're seeing these things for yourself for the
Developing
first
and
time.
happening.
Yeah. We didn't want it to just feel like a series of fans telling you how great Paul was, or reviews of every concert saying how great Paul was or wasn't.
No, and these kind of first-hand perspectives like that make it for a very interesting and easy read.
I mean, Shoko were absolutely brilliant. The access they gave us, and the documentation and everything like that. And you can see all that in those tour pages.
Oh God, yeah, all the detail. Even you got a couple of guys from Shoko who were just provided fantastic stories about the way that sometimes the lights had to be at a show, and sometimes there was an issue. I forget what concert it was, but there was a really bad lighting. Something bad happened, and they had to fix it quick. I forget what show that was that you've written about, but anecdotes like that from people like Shoko are just, you're not going to see that anywhere else in any other biography at all. Jumping ahead to London Town, which was, God, that took forever for that album to get finished. It took forever. Tom was like, man, London Town took forever to get done. February of 77, they go to the Virgin Islands, and those were some interesting stories, and the politics of, the boat and who's going to be on there. And again, I think Brian Brawley got hurt and Jeff Emmert got hurt and all these kind of people. They were not without, who got sunstroke. It was all kinds of stuff happening while they were vacationing in the Virgin Islands, making London Town. But that was a fascinating section to read in the book too. And how helpful, how easy was it pulling research for, the Virgin Island stuff, and who was your go-to person for a lot of that information?
Well, we had quite a lot of different sources for that. I mean, a big section of it at the time was actually covered in Club Sandwich. So there's some information from there. We also had the diaries of one of the roadies who was on tour, and even little pieces of information from people like photographers and Paul Gambaccini, who arrived, together with some session paperwork we had. We had some information from the recording engineer Tom Anderson, who passed away a couple of years ago. He even gave us the photographs that are in the book of, Paul in the makeshift recording booth, on the deck recording, I think, I'm Carrying. It's just incredible to see Paul standing on the deck of a ship with, a microphone in front of him or a guitar in his hand, recording a song, and that's exactly what you're hearing on that record. There's always part of me thinking, well, why am I not hearing seagulls, or why am I not hearing the ocean?
Right.
But yeah, it's like you say, that recording in the Virgin Islands on a boat with electricity, and, what could possibly, and blazing heat, what could possibly go wrong?
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Quite a lot. And that was a very interesting, that was a long timing thing. February, I think there were 3 weeks. How long was it? 3 weeks that they spent in the Virgin Islands, and then they came back?
Yeah, it was a few weeks, wasn't it? Yeah.
Started in London, Virgin Islands, and went back to London and then, obviously at that point, Joe English starts to make his exit from the story. And what a just a sad story with Joe. And and according to what you guys say, he was a very late addition to an interview for Volume 2, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was literally a few days before we delivered our final draft to our editor. Literally a few days. We were very lucky that the one of the producers on the Man on the Run film that I've been doing some consultation work on, she actually connected me with Joe. So I'm forever in her debt for doing so. And I spoke to Joe 2 consecutive days, basically. And we had a couple of long conversations. I found him to be kind of the opposite of Jeff Britton, really. Jeff's very much an open book, heart on his sleeve, very candid, larger than life kind of guy. Whereas Joe, it feels like he's just, he just wants to, I don't know, write off that period of his life. Doesn't really want to go there. So it was a very difficult interview. But I'm glad that we were able to tell, Joe's story, because I've said this before. I feel like Joe gets a little bit of a bum rap because everybody says Joe found God. That's the general line, isn't it?
Right.
But it was Joe's choice to withdraw from from public life and
Right.
and to join a Christian community.
Well, that and his wife had a horrific accident.
Yeah, and you
Right.
can't help but think when you read the book that there's definitely something in that she attributes her recovery from a terrible car accident which happened during the London town recording sessions
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
to her bringing God into her life. And then Joe comes back from London himself. He's battling drug addiction,
Right.
loneliness, depression. And, maybe a little bit of that did rub off on Joe. And, if that's what's kind of brought balance and happiness to Joe's life, then I think that's great. As a researcher and an interviewer, whether that's, writing a book or making a documentary or whatever it is that we do, I feel we've just got to be respectful of, those boundaries with people. And, that's why it did take so long to speak with Joe.
Sure.
And it was the same with
Right.
Jeff Britton. Jeff, before I spoke with Jeff, I think he'd given 2 interviews in something like 45 years before I spoke with him. But trying to make those breakthroughs with certain people, it can be difficult. And like I say, you just got to be respectful of their past and their present. But yeah, I'm glad that we were able to tell Joe's story in the book, and because it's very eye-opening. Yeah.
It is, and he comes back, and Paul says, well, take a month and think on it, and he never came back.
Yeah. Can I get one thing
Go ahead.
in?
Go ahead, Tom.
The album cover says Denny Lane, but Paul owns the music. Paul plays on all the music, and he produces the album. Does Paul own Holidays?
Plus, he owns the publishing.
Yes.
Right, and he owns the publishing. So, I mean, it's just I guess what I'm getting at is like, okay, if it comes up on its 50th anniversary, could he release the album like he's been doing with a lot of these anniversaries if he wanted to?
I'm sure he could. I bet MPL does own the masters of that. So, yeah, he could do, but it did get pretty scathing reviews. I'm not sure unless he were to do it as if he finally does the London Town archival set, he could do it as a bonus disc.
Yeah.
Right.
But
That's
like
what I was thinking too.
Like you did with Thrillington in the Ram box set.
Yeah, just slip it in there.
Yeah.
Maybe. One of the fascinating, again, the whole thing is, but really the Mull of Kintyre stories and how that came to be, and bringing the guys down to, well, first of all, recording it in Scotland, and then all the stories about, well, should the bagpipes be recorded indoors or should they be recorded outdoors, and then they figured out a way to record them indoors because they were too loud. And then Paul decides he wants to play bagpipes and he couldn't do it, so it was all that. And then the videos that were shot for it, and he brings them down from Scotland. There's everything about Mull of Kintyre was just so well written about in the book. And how many of those guys did you speak to that were the bagpipers? The kid was 14 or something at the time, right? That he was in the band.
Right.
Yeah, we interviewed 2 of those guys, and then we had some archive interviews with others. But yeah, obviously we also spoke to the designer, the architect who built the studio.
Yes.
And then other people, like we made a connection with a guy called Jim Miller, who was the journalist who was given exclusive access to the filming of the Mull of Kintyre video. And then he was on the bus with the Pipers when they went down to Air Studios in London.
Yeah.
For what sounds like just a 48-hour piss-up, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought Allan did an incredible job of binding that all together, particularly the Steve Thomas stuff. I think that was one of Allan's favorite interviews.
yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, what I really liked about that was where he says that, he wasn't particularly a Beatles fan. He was a Stones fan.
Oh, that was great. That was
Right.
great.
Yeah.
And if he was a Beatles fan, he would have been a John fan, not a Paul fan.
Yeah.
But that all of this worked in his favor because Paul knew he wasn't going to be, a sycophant.
Right.
And then, that, and then the outcome of that being at the end when Paul invites him up to hear Mull of Kintyre.
Oh,
and plays it for him
14 times.
times.
Yeah.
And until he finally says, okay, I like it. And he said, no, I know you don't, but this is for you, and gives him a cassette of Girls' School. I thought that was a really interesting, funny story. And yeah, he was a great interview.
And it was just amazing to see the self-doubt that Paul really had about issuing this as a single. You know, we'd heard he talked about it, but you really outlaid his decision making, and he was really up until the last minute not sure if he was going to really issue it as a single, because I guess he was kind of really nervous about the musical climate at the time to release it. I just didn't realize how more intensified it was with, you know, from reading it in the book, that it really was kind of a gamble for him to release it.
Well, you know, he believed in it. You know, he believed in it enough to have a studio built just to record it.
Right.
You know, and according to Steve Thomas, when he commissioned him to build the studio, he was saying, I'm going to do this single. It's going to be the biggest single of all time. You know, so that was in advance. But then, you know, we get to the sessions, and he's talking to the bagpipers, and they're saying, oh, you got to do it as a single. And he's saying, well, you know, I don't know. You can see why. I mean, you know, what was going on the British charts, particularly, well, on the American charts too, just wasn't a Scottish waltz with bagpipes, you know. So it was kind of daring to put that out. And you know, again, you know, we talked about Paul not wanting to take people's advice, but sometimes it really works for him. You know, he went with his gut, he put it out, and it outsold all the Beatles singles.
Yeah, November of '77, it just comes out, and went with his gut, and it was proven right. But that was the Mull of Kintyre stuff, and then the videos, how they were shot, and the second video with the fake. Oh, they're bringing in a fog machine for the smoke, and all on a soundstage. You know, where was that shot again? Where was the second video shot?
That was actually the third, because they shot a cheap kind of low budget video as well at EMI Studios.
Right.
But that final one, I think, was shot at Elstree, wasn't it? And
Elstree.
On a big sound stage.
Mm.
Yeah, and those poor guys had to, you know, recreate the Scottish Highlands in a
and
studio.
that was, I just remember this thing in the book now. There was a great story about they came down and they were like, we can't play this again. And of course, they didn't want to violate the musicians' union's rules, right? So, and Paul's like, no, don't worry, you're not going to. But then there were guys from the musicians' unions there to make sure that they played it. But then I think somebody just escorted them out. And they didn't have to do it anyway. That was great. That was so good.
Yeah, that basically sums up the entire 1970s in one anecdote.
That was so. We can't play those parts again. You're not going to. Shh. That was so good. That was such a great story. Go ahead, Tom.
We, you know, around this time now, we're starting to see the names Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley come up, and when they're signed, I was really intrigued to learn that they're signed as MPL employees and not necessarily, how would you say, like band members, right? So they're really not like getting an equal share. I mean, how would be the right way to put this? I mean, they're just MPL employees.
Well,
I guess see in the book.
I guess basically at this point it was the first time that they had proper formal contracts, you know, whereby you know, they'd be guaranteed a percentage of box office takings when they toured.
Okay.
And they were paid a retainer and a yearly fee. But yeah, I don't know whether I suppose you could classify them as MPL employees because they were under contract with MPL. Right. So yeah.
Yeah, it's just fascinating because one of the great things you guys do in this book, okay, and whether or not you want to say Wings is a band or Wings is not as a band, is you guys present the evidence for both cases, and you don't really give an answer to that, but you let the people will judge whether or not they think Wings is a band or Wings isn't a band because of all the evidence that you bring in. There's so many great quotes from like Jimmy or Denny that suggest, well, we're just their sidemen. And then even Steve, when he comes over and listens to McCartney too, and then he starts getting the feeling, well, this isn't really going to maybe last much longer. But then on the other hand, you get all these quotes from Paul saying, well, I'm really, we're really trying to make this an effort into being a band. And here's Steve and Lawrence, and they're going to go promote Back to the Egg. And so here he is really trying to put forth the effort. But we know all along, I mean, looking back at it now, that it is what it is. But I'm really proud of how you guys did this. And you just didn't really give an answer. You just presented both cases, and now you're leaving it us to make the decision. And was that something you guys intended to do? Did you guys intend to do it that way?
The question is, what's a band? And there are a million different answers of what a band is, and we're looking really closely at Paul and what kind of band he has, because the Beatles were the Beatles, and it wasn't going to be the Beatles, no matter what, no matter how you define band. It wasn't going to be the Beatles. It couldn't be the Beatles because only one of them had been a Beatle, and that gave it a built-in inequality. Not only, and even forget Beatle, only one of them was a really, really accomplished songwriter, recognized as a virtuoso bassist, a quite good guitarist, even a pretty good drummer, very good keyboard player. None of them could quite match everything he brought to the table. So what is a band with a person like that going to be? It almost inevitably is going to be him and the people who were supporting him, whether you want to call them sidemen or band members or not. But the one thing that was going on during all of this is that he really wanted it to be a band, and he encouraged as much as he could, he tried getting Denny to write songs starting in '73. There was a lot of talk publicly. Paul would say in interviews, I want Denny to write and contribute songs to the band. When he signed Lawrence and Steve, part of their contract had a provision that, if they wrote songs, they'd be published by MPL. So they're envisioning the possibility that they would be writing and contributing songs to the group. He wanted it to be a band where everybody contributed, but offsetting that is the fact that he still was Paul McCartney, and he was never not going to be Paul McCartney. And it's like that old Chevy Chase line, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not, and they just, no one was going to quite equal that. And not to mention, forgetting everything else I said, the fact is that everybody coming to see them was coming to see Paul,
Paul.
Like there were no people who might like Wings as Wings, but you didn't get people saying, I'm going to see Denny Lane and his group tonight. When they went to a Wings show, So it was an impossible situation. I think he sincerely wanted it to be seen as a band and function as a band, except that he would be the boss.
Exactly.
I think we're also way beyond the 60s at this point, aren't we? So Wings were never going to be the cute one, the quiet one. They were never going to be the Beatles, were they?
It was going to be the drunk
in
one.
That respect. And then, like Allan said, I think also the inequality within the group was always going to raise this question of whether or not Wings was a band or not a band, because Paul's paying their wages effectively.
Sure.
And they were never on the same level, financially or otherwise.
Right.
So there's always going to be that debate.
The fact that he wanted to bring back that aspect of like, hey, we're just a little band, and even as late as 1979 with the last incarnation of Wings, wanting to do smaller venues and smaller, things like that. He never really strays from that.
Back to the Egg. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where the thing
Right.
comes from. You know,
That's
he
where it
wanted
comes
to-
from.
He wanted to go back to the
Right.
egg. He wanted to play small venues again. He wanted to. I mean, I'm sure a psychologist would read more into this. You know, is it the Oedipus complex where you want to just basically go back inside your mother or something? You know, it really is that though with Paul. It does that with. If you look at every single band Paul has ever worked with, the touring band, how does he break them in?
Right.
He plays old rockers.
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
And goes back.
Right.
And goes back.
He
And
goes
goes back.
He goes back to the egg every time he brings in a new band.
Right.
And you've seen him in Soundcheck. What does he play in Soundcheck? He plays some old rockers.
Check,
In
right.
Seal, it's the same
Rockers.
thing. He's been doing the same thing now for 50 or 60 years. You know, and
Yeah.
that's
Good
really
point.
what it boils down to. You know, even
then
released
speaking-
an album of it, didn't he? You know, the Russian album was effectively him breaking a band in. They were rehearsing old
Yeah.
rockers. That's how we got the Russian album.
Good point. Good point. Speaking of financial, now we come to him signing with Columbia, which this is a massive deal. I mean, 20 million over 3 years. When he's getting like 1 or 2 million advance. The royalty rate, 22% royalty rate, $1.55 per album. It's insane. MPL will own and he owns the masters. On top of that, Paul received ownership of the Frank Music Corporation, like I said earlier, and then EMI then increases Paul royalties of the Beatles back catalog, which we know later, which we know what will happen, there in the 80s. But this deal, again, I mean, Wings is only Wings because Paul is getting these deals, though, right? I mean, they can only go where Paul can go, and then now we're going to Columbia, and this deal was, I mean, this is a very lucrative deal. Sure. And Andy, as you said, I mean, this was like one of the worst kept secrets too, as you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I mean, for months before they announced that he signed, everybody was assuming that he was going to Columbia. I mean, he did turn up at that Columbia party. That was sort of a clue, but bad news for Warner after all they'd done.
Right, but the extra incentive on the Beatles tracks doesn't really get discovered until a couple years later.
No.
Right.
Yeah, that took some unraveling for us, didn't it, actually? Yeah, as to when he got that uplift, and we discovered it was on that contract in '79.
It was that exact contract, not any other. Was that specific one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You look at every contract he signs, he gets some incentive to re-sign, whether it's with EMI or Columbia or Capitol, whoever it is. You know, his in-laws were incredible negotiators, and well, to be fair, they had a pretty strong hand when they were negotiating, on behalf of the former Beatle.
Of course. How were Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley as interviewers, for this period?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Lawrence has an encyclopedia type memory. He can tell you what the minute he met Paul, the day he met Paul. He can recall those facts and dates. We've had him on, not in a couple of years, but he's always been a great interview, and he can recall facts and effortlessly.
Of course, the moment he met Paul, he was in the men's rooms.
Yes.
You might remember that.
But
Steve was really good too, and Adrian interviewed Lawrence. I interviewed Steve, but we've had Lawrence on Things We Said Today, and then of course the two of us interviewed both of them together at the last fest.
Right.
So they're great with. They've got great stories, and I have a lot of respect for them both as musicians, and clearly Paul was beginning to get over the idea of having a band, at that period. And he had, didn't like Back to the Egg as much as I think he should, because I love that album. But, here we have two excellent musicians. I mean, Juber can play anything. He had been in jazz orchestras. He was trained as a classical player. He grew up, listening to the Beatles and playing rock, and you look at what he brought to Back to the Egg, in terms of experimental stuff with that Eventide harmonizer, with he and Paul collaborating on a guitar line where neither of them knew what it was going to sound like, because the notes Lawrence was playing were not the notes that were coming through the Eventide harmonizer, so it was sort of a mystery to both of them, and it worked. But neither of those musicians were going to be complaining about not touring or whether their solo was getting played or what they were doing. They were extremely professional and cooperative, and you would think everything Paul was looking for all these years in Wings. And the timing just wasn't good for them, I guess.
No, and I know, Allan, you speak highly of that lineup. I think that's one of your favorite lineups of Wings. I think you've said that on record before, and they are there for obvious reasons. One of the things that's puzzling, really, with about this period is towards the end with this Columbia contract. All of his albums come out again on Columbia, except London Town. Why?
Well, if you keep in mind that the contract, it would be like, 5 years after they were originally released, and it's possible. Let me see, 5 years. I think he was still under contract with Columbia, so I don't know why it didn't.
Unless it has it. Did it get it? I don't think it's got a Columbia release, right? London Town.
Maybe Columbia made the decision themselves not to release it.
It's too close to when he signed the contract.
Possibly too close to its original release date, possibly.
Because in the book you wrote how it would include London Town, but I don't think I've ever seen a copy of London Town on Columbia Records ever.
I have to look into that.
Because you did say that because when you wrote that in the book, I was like, so this includes through London Town, but I've never seen that anywhere. So it's worth a little bit of a dig for that.
Yeah.
for sure. A couple more final quick questions, wrapping up, and of course with Back to the Egg, the video age is kind of big. He does 8 videos for the album, the Back to the Egg video special. Talk about your experience talking with Keith McMillan from Keith Co. And how, because Paul used those guys a lot, especially in the 80s. I mean, he just used Keith Co. for all of his stuff, and it seems like he was a good source of material for this part of the book too.
Well, interestingly, you probably never realised this, but we didn't get to speak to Keith because he basically refused an interview. He doesn't really do interviews, Keith. So I delved into the archives, and what you're reading there is some interviews he did, basically sometimes within weeks, sometimes a couple of years after the event.
Okay.
And I found some of them on obscure late night BBC kind of art house programs with Keith. I'm sure if you look at the sources at the end, you'll see them. And also we got a lot of information from various other sources to do with Keith, in terms of filming schedules and other documentation. So we were able to fully and properly describe all of the work that he did with Paul, because I mean, by 1980, which we don't cover in this book, he was doing some pretty groundbreaking stuff. He did the video for Coming Up, which features, a composite of Paul and Linda, and they must have been composited about 10 times.
Oh my God!
Within the same shot. So the stuff that he was doing at that time was really groundbreaking. Maybe in the future he'll change his stance and we'll get to talk to him. It'd be great.
It would.
Yeah, the interviews I found with him in the 70s and 80s were brilliant.
Yeah,
really interesting guy.
Because it reads like it's in real time as you've written the book this way. Right. So it looks like it's a fresh interview, but it's from back then. But good stuff. Good stuff. That
editorial sleight of hand, we call that, Andy.
Yeah, a little bit.
We're kind of hoping that, a lot of people who we approached originally and thought, okay, it's in another Paul McCartney book, I'm not doing it, will have seen the first 2 volumes and, may change their mind about whether to talk to us when we approach them again.
Hopefully.
Cool. Yeah, hopefully. A lot of people out there, are confused with Rockestra. Okay, we haven't had a reissue of Back to the Egg, I think, since '93 of the Paul McCartney collection from the UK. I think that was the last time Back to the Egg was reissued in the UK or America. Do we know if Rockestra is holding up any kind of reissue for a Back to the Egg reissue?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Well-
we know for a fact that nobody signed releases.
Well, that you talk about that in the book, if I may, real quick.
Yeah.
And I was wondering
Right.
maybe this is why, because he secretly filmed the session and hid a camera behind like a fake wall. 2 of them, I believe, actually, because he didn't get permission. Is maybe that why it's been held up?
Yeah, I mean, the people we spoke to all said that they were aware of the fact that they were being filmed. You know, I did an email interview with David Gilmour, which was just sort of like one-word answers, so you don't really see much of that in the book. And I said to him, you know, were you aware of the fact that you were being filmed? His answer was yes. so I just get the feeling that it's one of those things, unfortunately, you know, when you operate in the documentary filmmaking world, which I know a little bit of something about, is that you do need to get these things called signed release forms.
Yes.
If you're gonna put something on television, or you're gonna put it on a cinema screen. But I
Right.
can't imagine it would be
Well,
that difficult for Paul to get retrospective releases for those people if they decide to reissue
Right.
it. I mean, I'd love
Right,
to
well, I
see
understand
a good print of Rockestra, because all the bootlegs we've got of it are really lousy.
Well, we did get an official. We got an official version of it on Wingspan.
Yeah, but
It's not great.
not great. No,
It's not great at all.
no.
You know, and I can understand the needing to get signed off for a video aspect of it, but for audio wise, I mean, they had to have the permission from their
Record
respective
companies. Yeah.
record
La-
companies
labels.
to be
Yeah.
ordered on their labels to be on the album in the first place. So is that once you do get that, I mean, that's forever, right? I mean, and it could be reissued
Sure.
whenever they want to reissue it, as long as
Yeah.
the record label signed off on it.
Yeah.
Right. I think the real issue is that Paul just hasn't liked the album that much, but like with many of his albums, including Wildlife, you know, he has a story of
Right.
okay, I listened. My son played that album a few weeks ago, and I heard it, and it really wasn't all that bad. So maybe he'll change his mind. He
Right.
just needs to sit down and listen to it again, and and also hear that other people like it. So, otherwise, there may be larger reasons within the entire archival reissue program that he's not doing it.
Right.
So, because there hasn't been one in quite a while, really, of
Yeah.
any
Right.
kind.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see two sets from 2 different decades drop at the same time. You know, maybe he'll do London Town and Press to Play or something like
Ooh.
that. Yeah, and really surprise us, rather than giving 2 back-to-back wing
Well,
sets.
I think that the work that you've done in this book, especially on this period, might catch some attention and say, you know what, now here's these 2 albums that a lot of my fan bases would really like to be re-released, and now you've just brilliantly written about it and researched it in a great way, and hopefully, it might turn an ear or two
Well,
to
we get-
release that.
We get messages all the time through email and social media from people saying, you know what, I really didn't think this was a great period of Paul's career. But, I've been listening to those records and I think they're fantastic.
Right.
People actually going out and buying copies of the records since they've heard the album, since they've read the book. So, I think that's absolutely fantastic that you can shine a spotlight on a lesser known period of Paul's career. And really, if there's a period of Paul's career that's been, the least documented, it's 74 to 80.
Which is his highest commercial success as an artist, and you would think that it would be, but it's not.
But yeah, because a lot of those things have yet to see a reissue. It's like the Dark Ages, really. If you speak to a
Right.
lot of people, they'll probably say the same about albums like Press to Play. That's like the McCartney Dark Ages. A lot of people have probably never even heard of that album.
No,
Right.
not at all, not at all. Tom, you got any other
Last thing,
final questions?
One last thing is during this whole time during Wings, every single hits the top 40 here in the U.S. Not so much. I mean, do you guys have a theory as to why you think he had the more success here in the States during the 70s than he did in the UK? I mean, they were okay. I mean, and plus, I think he took more crap from journalists in the UK than he did here in the States. But I mean,
Yeah.
that is quite a feat, though. Every single release Under Wings was a top 40 hit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that the critics play a lot into it. If the critics are really giving Paul's work a hard time, then it's not going to sell well because it's not cool to buy it. I suppose Mull of Kintyre was the great exception, but I think if you look into the demographic of people who bought Mull of Kintyre, they probably weren't your typical Wings fans. They would have been, like
Your aunties and
mothers and grandmothers,
your aunties and stuff like that. Yeah.
Right.
yeah, because it was one of those songs that you put on around Christmas, and yeah,
That's a number one. That's a number one.
that's right, yeah. But
Well, I think that's
but
where
it's, but it's interesting,
that's
like you
where
say,
he was smart.
he had so
Go ahead.
so much commercial success in America.
Right.
But then you look at the the general response from critics in America was other than Rolling Stone fairly positive, and your music trades in America are far more forgiving of singles than our music trades over here.
Oh,
in Great
some
Britain.
of the reviews for the singles that you guys published in Sounds and some of the UK trade mags, they were ruthless
Brutal.
to him.
Yeah, I mean those music trades were like training grounds for journalists to kind of express themselves, and you get the feeling that from one week to the next they were just playing a game of one-upmanship. Who could write the kind of most outrageous review this week?
No.
That's probably Charles Shaw Murray. Obviously, got is still wearing the crown on that.
It has to be. I love that clip of Paul from the Paul McCartney special in 1986 where he's chewing on the pencil. That's a good one. I don't like that. And he's just imitating with critics for listening to his, just picking away at all of his music. It's something that has really been, something that has bothered him for a long, long time. And he's a people pleaser. He's a people pleaser. He wants to please everybody. And when somebody doesn't like his stuff, he gets pissed off. I get it.
But you can still see it to this day, though, that Paul's got such a phenomenal following over in the States. It probably sells 10 times as many records in the States as he does over here in the UK.
Well, recently the charts have been nicer to him in the UK than they have been here.
Yeah, he seems to be having a bit of a mini renaissance. Yeah, I'd
a little
say.
bit. Ever since Glasgow in 2022. I mean, those shows in Manchester that we saw were. We saw those, Adrian. It was.
Over here, I guess since the Queen passed away, he's become like our adopted king, because people really aren't that fond of Prince Charles.
No.
So they sort of look at people like Paul as being
Look
a
at
bit of
Macca.
a sort of rock and roll statesman.
I love it.
And he's more likable than Mick Jagger. So yeah.
Well, that's easy. That's just easy. Great. Well, this was fantastic. All right, one final question. Now that you've got 2 out, when can we expect a deal for Volume 3? Alan's like, we just spent 10 years of our life doing this. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the word?
Well,
yeah, we don't know. But I'm pretty confident that it will happen, and I think Adrian is too. Our publisher said that she was into it, so we just need to sort of see to the C's and Q's and whatever.
Yeah, but we are working on it.
You are. You're doing all your research. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
excellent.
I was just looking over at the weekend, actually, all of the studio information for Tug of War and Pipes of Peace, looking at all
that stuff at Air Montserrat and all that,
and looking at the track listing for the 2 LP version of Tug of War, which was really interesting.
Ooh.
Yeah. So there's a little tidbit for you.
I'll have to send you our interview with Jerry Murata. Fantastic interview. And then we also talked to Dave Maddox as well.
We did.
Yeah.
We did. A couple of the people.
I recall hearing those at the time. Yeah.
So there's a little cookie for you for Volume 3. A double LP proposed listing of Tug of War. Goody. Well, Allan and Adrian, it has been a pleasure having you guys on tonight to do an in-depth kind of review of the book. We didn't hit on every detail. We couldn't do that, otherwise it would be a 7-hour show. But it's exhaustive. It's exhaustive, but not exhausting, as one of your reviewers quoted, and it's very true. And it's something that you can go back to and reread, and it's the Bible, folks. It's the Bible. Okay, it is. It's the Bible. It's the one to go back to and reference it. And guys, I can't thank you enough for being here tonight and giving us a few, just a little bit of your time.
Our pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
always.
you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Real quick before we sign off, Allan, Adrian, would you like to plug anything? Things we said today, things you're working on, Adrian, or not, before we close it out?
Yeah, I don't think many people who watch this or listen to this will be interested in the fact that I'm working on a low-budget documentary series for Channel 4 right now in England. So there's not really much for me to plug.
Okay,
but if you are in England, then I'm currently working on the 4th series of the excellent Help We Bought a Village for Channel 4. So, whilst also doing development work on Volume 3 of our series. So.
Absolutely. Stay tuned for more information on that from Adrian. Allan?
I guess I'm mostly just sort of collecting some information for Volume 3. I've been going through, I've got pretty much every issue of Rolling Stone here, and going through page by page that entire decade and scanning them, and then making them into scannable searchable PDFs, which I'll then send a lot over to Adrian, and we'll go through those. And there are other things like, Beatle Fan, which really just sort of started up at the end of Volume 2. They did a lot of interesting coverage and, interviews and things like that we'll be sort of using as source material too. We're compiling lists of people, wish lists of interviewees. So getting that stuff together, and basically that.
All right. Well, listen, it's been a blast. Adrian and Allan, thank you so much for some time tonight, and we'll talk to you soon. So for Adrian, for Allan, and for Tom, I'm Andy Nichols, and this has been episode 271 of Two Legs, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.